is on fire! Of a strategic target. The ship is on fire. Support.
Alright, so we're back once again, and today we're going to be discussing the state of World of Warships, and more specifically, how long World of Warships will be around for. This is an often talked about question, and a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about this topic, especially when new content is released. But with that being said, let's actually talk about how long they'll be around for. So, as you probably know, World of Warships has been around for quite a while. It was introduced initially on the 17th of September 2015, which means it's been here for a staggering 5 years, this coming September. In this video we're going to look at a couple of more key aspects to the game, and really figure out just how long this game has left in terms of popularity, so let's get into it. This video is going to be divided into 3 sections. Firstly, we're going to discuss the history of the game, some of the major changes of the past and how they affected the game, and how the game has morphed into its current state. Then we're going to take a little bit more of a recent look at the game, and some of the decisions in the game, and get a sense of the overall direction of the game, so we can better gauge in just what direction, either gaining popularity or declining in popularity, the game is headed. And finally we're going to go through some analytics, so we can really ground some of the things we've been talking about, and just put some real facts to the discussion of where the game is headed in the next few years. So let's get into it, and if you enjoy this content, you can of course subscribe. Okay, so let's talk about the history. So, World of Warships came out in September of 2015, and at that time, the only lines that really truly existed in the game were the Japanese line, the American lines, the Russian/USSR line, and the UK line. So from that perspective, the game has come a long way, as now there's more than 10 lines, including, for example, the French line, Italian line, Pan-Asian line, just to name a few. So one thing's for sure, the content isn't slowing down. To add to this, there's also been several major content changes to the game over the course of its history. These are not limited to things such as the CV rework, the introduction of new currencies such as steel and copper, and the game has even had its fair share of controversies over fairly dubious in-game content celebrations, such as the Puerto Rico disaster, the dockyard, stuff like that. But with all that being said, the game seems to have been able to steady the ship to an extent over the years, especially when you think about such things as the art in the game, the community interaction. Even myself, I haven't played the game from the start. I've come from other different online games such as League of Legends, Battlefield, all those kind of games that are maybe a bit more popular, but the community interaction is actually surprisingly good for World of Warships from what I can tell. Now again, that's just my one person perspective, so take that into consideration, but I think the community interaction here is very good. On the art side, things are obviously really good. Take for example just the dockyard, which is another really fun thing that's been started off initially pretty bad, but it's actually been taken back and made into actually kind of fun. I like the idea of it, so bear that in mind. Those are 2 things that are just an example of where the game's gone right, and even though maybe some of the critique in the community interaction aspect of it isn't always taken into consideration, at least it's there. Let's go with that. But only really time will tell as to whether these content decisions, go against a large amount of the vocal part of the community, will end up either hurting and hemorrhaging the game, or will allow it to actually grow and create a new audience. Well, that's really all I want to say about the history. I think I've given just a general overall view of, how the game's developed over the years, what's going on, and I don't want to delve too much deeper because you could probably make an hour-long video easily on the history of the game. Okay, so let's move on to some of the more recent content decisions that have been introduced into the game, and let's see how they affect the overall gameplay. I think the best way to do this is go through all the classes in the game and discuss how they're faring in the current state of the game. First, we're going to start with battleships. Battleships' future is very up in the air at the moment, and I believe it hinges effectively on one thing: submarines, and more importantly, whether submarines will become a playable class in random battles. I suppose this point extends to other classes also, but in the battleship's case, if submarines were introduced into a bigger game mode like random battles, it would be a very great threat to the current state of battleships and the classes as a whole. That is assuming there's no change to current iterations of the ships currently in the game, be it battleships or submarines or any other class. The ability for a class, such as submarines, to damage another class with no recourse is something very rare and very dangerous for a healthy game to implement. But again, this hinges on submarines being introduced into random battles, which may or may not happen. But one thing is for sure, if this is going to be the case going forward, then it might just have a very stark consequence for the game overall. So if we move on to cruisers, I can see no real issue with this line. They seem to be able to be the most adaptable class in the game, perhaps aside from carriers, which is a whole other topic. Some of them do suffer from the fact that they don't have depth charges to deal with the submarines, but most do. Alongside this, they also are generally capable of at least partially dealing with carrier planes. So all in all, I don't see cruisers getting all that much worse or even better as time goes on. I see them staying constantly stable as time goes on and just occupying that midpoint. And now we get on to the workhorse, the destroyers. Destroyers in the game are in... I don't know how to describe it as being a pretty bad place or being a pretty overworked space. They have the most to do out of any class of ship, between spotting, smoking, torping, dealing damage, getting 50% of your HP taken by planes, or being perma-spotted by submarines at 5.9/6 kilometers. The role of a destroyer is the most under threat. And maybe even under threat isn't the best way to put it. I think being overwhelmed is probably a better way, and I've already spoken to several destroyer players, and they're just not enjoying the state the game currently is in. And I can say this as myself as a destroyer player, that although it is a very punishing game state currently, I'm not actually getting all that lack of enjoyment out of it. Honestly, the thing that annoys me the most is the inability to counter certain gameplays. So things like getting randomly dropped by rocket planes is pretty obnoxious, but it happens maybe once every couple of games, so it's not that big of a deal to me. I can still interact with other three ship classes mostly, and as a function of me playing at relatively high tiers, I can maybe deal with one, maybe two carriers max per game. Now lower tiers could be much more problematic, but again, everything in context. If you enjoy playing lower tier, taking into consideration there's going to be a lot more unfun. But I think that's pretty much all I want to leave with destroyers. I could say again a lot more, but I don't want this video to get too long. Now I was going to touch on both submarines and carriers, but in all honesty, the way in which carriers affect the game alongside submarines is a whole different ballgame, and they're fundamentally different to the other three classes in the game. So me commenting on them would be biased, and I would be unable to give the perspective of the actual submarine player or the carrier player, seeing as I don't play those classes. So in order to keep this fair and honest, I'm just not going to comment on them. Now let's move on to the final aspect of this, analytics. And we're going to start with the Steam charts. World of Warships has been available on Steam since November 2017. Since then there's been a couple of trends. Now, before we get into this, I just want to preface this part of the video with the fact that I'm using Steam charts. So it doesn't take into account all the players in the game, but as it's difficult to get data on the overall player base and trends, I think it's a good compromise. And another thing I want to point out about Steam charts, usually I think for a lot of players it's going to be easier to get into the game on Steam than it is going to be just going through PC. And there's a reason for this. The fact that it's on the Steam store probably appeals to a lot more of a casual player than it would to like a hardcore player that would specifically search out this type of game and then go to the website and download it. There's a lot of extra steps there. So I think the Steam charts actually provides a very unique perspective on player acquisition and how much they actually grow as a result of them. So with that being said, we're going to get into a couple of these trends. Now, firstly, you can clearly see that the game has been relatively stable since its introduction in 2017. It started off at a decent 3,000 average players after about a month or so of being on Steam, and since then you can clearly see some reductions in player base, mostly around the summertime. However, I don't think this is a fault of the game, more of a fact that it's summer and most people want to be outside and spend less time inside playing games, so take that into consideration. So if we look from June 2018 onwards, we can clearly see an upward trend. More players seem to be getting into the game. If we look at the time where the carrier rework was introduced to the game, you can see that there isn't actually all that much of a player drop-off, at least in the Steam side of things. And I think it's important to point out that because there was so much anger about the rework, about the quality of the games, but this doesn't seem to manifest in an actual amount of players playing the game. And I think this points to a fact that probably the minority will always voice their opinion the strongest and most stubbornly, and they might not be actually all that representative of the overall majority who's actually enjoying the game or playing the game. So be very careful of that, especially when you're reading things like Reddit and other forums and stuff like that. So the growth continues well in 2019, and the winter of 2019 was one of the best times for World of Warships on Steam in terms of growth. Then it seems with the introduction of submarines, there's a bit of a drop off in terms of players. Now, whether this is indicative of longer term trends is difficult to say, but based on current stats, the submarines could really impact the long term thriving of the game, for points we pointed out earlier in the previous point. You know, the interaction with other ship classes, be it battleships, cruisers, or even carriers. So I think we're at a very pivotal point with the game, and I think submarines are going to make it or break it. But with that being said, the game's lasted 5 years, which is a lot more than a few other AAA titles, so it's not a bad achievement at all. And overall, I think the game's in a pretty decent spot. It seems healthy, even with a slight drop off recently. I can easily see this game being around for a couple of more years at worst, and a long time at best. But with that being said, that was my opinion. Now I want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below how long you think this game's going to last, whether you agree to me or not. If you liked this video, give it a like. If you didn't, dislike it. And if you enjoy, you can subscribe. But until next time, I'll see you in the next one.